Today I'm going to show you how to keep your garden blooming all season long. Hi, it's Steph. Welcome back to my garden. In today's video, I'm going to talk about a topic that most experienced gardeners are very familiar with, deadheading. And if you're a newer gardener, what is deadheading? That is the process of going through and taking off the blooms that are done blooming off of your plant. Here I'm standing by a group of my Shasta daisies, and this is an example of a plant that has some blooms that look really nice and beautiful and fresh, and some that are now past their prime and done blooming and need to be cleaned up. To deadhead my Shasta daisy, I'm going to follow the spent bloom all the way to the bottom to the next set of leaves, and I'm going to cut off the stem. So why did I just deadhead this Shasta daisy? I took off all of these spent blooms to clean up my plant and keep it looking tidy. But also, by deadheading and taking off these spent blooms, it will keep your plant producing new blooms. And if I didn't go through and deadhead it, it would signal to the plant that it is done producing blooms, and it would then start setting seed. And if you start setting seed, it's done blooming for the season. So with perennials, it's really important to go through and deadhead so that you can keep those blooms coming. Speaking of plants going to seed, you might not necessarily want a plant to go to seed, because if it does, it's going to drop those seeds all over your garden, and it could become invasive by giving you a ton of seedlings that you don't want to deal with. For example, I have here a rose campion, and it has these really pretty carnation flowers, but it is now done blooming, and you can see that it has already started to form these seed pods. Now, I know from experience that this plant will create a ton of seedlings. So before this plant has a chance to go ahead and drop seed, I'm going to go through and deadhead it to clean this plant up and prevent it from dropping seed. To deadhead this rose campion, I'm just using some pruners. I'm using my Felco pruners, and I'm just cutting the stems at the bottom to take off all of the spent blooms and the seed pods. Here's an example of a plant that I am not going to deadhead because I do want it to drop seed in my garden and produce more blooms for me. This is a columbine that bloomed beautifully for me this spring. I have let the plant dry out, and I'm going to let it drop seed so that it can give me more columbine in this space. When it comes to deadheading, there are a couple of tools you can use. You can use some floral snips or some pruners to cut, or you can also use your fingers to do something called pinching. Now, you might have heard of the term pinching before, and it's just another method of deadheading. And what pinching is going into a plant and using your fingers to pinch off some growth. And so, for example, here I have zinnias, which are a great plant to do pinching on. And what you would do is follow that stem down and use your fingers to pinch the branch off. And what that's going to do is it's going to encourage more side shoots. And when you get more side shoots on your plant, you will get more blooms. So while it might forego a bloom now, you are going to get more blooms later. Now that we've talked about pinching for deadheading, we'll go ahead and talk about cutting. And here I have my floral snips and some beautiful dahlias. Now, dahlias are an annual. In order to keep this beautiful plant producing blooms from now until my first hard frost, you want to regularly deadhead it. You can see here that this dahlia is now past its prime. It's starting to brown and needs to be cut off. So what you would do is you would follow the stem all the way down, and where it meets another bloom bud or a leaf, you would go ahead and make a cut and remove that bloom. And now my dahlia will keep producing more of these large, beautiful blooms. And here's another example. When it comes to deadheading, it's important to know what type of plant you're dealing with and whether or not it's a good candidate for deadheading. And you could always do a Google search to figure that out. But I'm going to give you a couple of examples. There are sunflowers that are a single flower per stem. So if I went ahead and I deadheaded this annual sunflower, that is it. That is the only flower that I'm getting off of this plant. There would be no more blooms that would be pushed out. And here is an example of a perennial that if I did go ahead and deadhead, I would not get any more blooms out of. This is a lily, and a lily is grown from a bulb. So you have one bulb that sends up this one bloom stalk with several blooms. If I were to go ahead and cut this bloom stalk off, I would not get any more blooms off of this lily. Now let's go ahead and go into the garden and let me show you some perennials that if I did deadhead, I would continue to get more blooms from. Here in this bed, I have coneflowers, and there are several varieties of coneflowers, and this is a plant or perennial that I regularly deadhead throughout the season. Here's an example of how I would deadhead this double scoop raspberry coneflower. You can see here that this bloom is now past its prime. So I would go ahead and follow this stem all the way down, and I would go ahead and prune it off. Now I have some coneflowers here that you can see is already producing some side shoots or additional bloom buds. So this one, now that it's past its prime, I'm going to go through and I'm going to follow it down and make sure to just make a cut at this stem and leaving all of those side blooms intact. And you can see that it's going to continue to produce blooms for me. When it comes to my coneflowers, these are also known as echinacea. I will stop deadheading them at some point towards the end of the summer. And the reason for that is because I like to leave these big, beautiful cones intact over the winter. Not only do they provide a lot of visual interest in the garden, they also provide food for our wildlife friends. And the birds, specifically the finches, really love the seeds on the coneflower heads. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some more perennials that I can deadhead. Shasta daisies, another quintessential perennial garden flower. And this one here does really well with deadheading. If I go through and I cut off the dead heads, it will continue to push out blooms for me at least for a little bit longer. Rudbeckia, most commonly known as black-eyed Susans. This is another great plant that if you deadhead it, you will continue to get blooms sometimes into the fall. Now my variety just started blooming, so I don't have any blooms that I can deadhead. But what you would do is once your bloom is past its prime, you would go ahead, follow your stem down and make a cut to clean it up and keep it producing more blooms. Garden phlox. Now here is a garden phlox that looks beautifully in bloom right now. And I'm going to show you one that has finished blooming and that needs to be cleaned up. And here is another variety of phlox. This one is now done blooming and you can see that it's already started to produce seed heads. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow this stem down and I'm going to deadhead it by cutting that off. And you can see that it has already started to produce some side shoots with more blooms. The same right here. So I am cleaning up my plant and encouraging more bloom production. Here's another really common garden perennial, and this is called Salvia. And Salvia has these really beautiful purple spike blooms. And you can still see some of the color here on the tip of this bloom spike. But as you can see, this Salvia is now pretty much done producing blooms. It is all spent and ready to be cleaned up. So I would go ahead and remove these spent blooms, and then this Salvia will produce more blooms for me and get a secondary flush. I have a video on my channel that I created on how I prune my Salvia to keep it blooming most of the season that I will link below in the description as well as in the pinned comment. And nepta is another garden perennial that looks very similar to the Salvia, that is mounded with these purple spike blooms that also benefits from deadheading. So you can see this one here, I actually recently went through and cut off all of the spent blooms and it's already sending up some new purple blooms for me. Now, something to note about some plants that you deadhead is that the first bloom is always going to be the most prolific, and then the secondary blooms are going to be a little more sparse, but you will still get blooms off of that plant. So it is very beneficial to keep deadheading. Roses, another perennial that really benefits from being regularly deadheaded. When you deadhead your rose, you're not only cleaning off the spent blooms to improve the appearance of your rose, but you are also improving airflow, which can prevent disease. And roses can be really prone to disease. And you get the added benefit of the rose continuing to produce bloom buds for you. For me here in my zone 6, I can get my roses to produce blooms for me from spring all the way through late fall when we have our first hard frost by regularly deadheading it. To deadhead your rose is really easy. You want to find your spent blooms and follow the stem down to your next set of 5 leaves, and then make your cut. I also have a video on my channel on how I deadhead and fertilize my knockout roses, which I can link below. Deadheading is a really simple task, and when I go out to deadhead, I just like to grab a few things. My apron, because I can keep all of my tools on hand. And what I take out with me are usually just some hand tools, some basic pruners or floral snips. You can even use some scissors. Some gloves to protect my hands. And I like to keep a small bottle of isopropyl alcohol so that I can spray my pruners or snips between plants. It's really important to keep your tools clean so that you don't spread disease from plant to plant. And a yard waste basket. I like my pop-up bag that I use to put all of my clipped cuttings into.